Formula One has had a history of dramatic crashes and horrifying accidents. With drivers going at crazy fast speeds, things don't always go as planned, and sometimes the result can be deadly. These are some of the most dramatic crashes in Formula One's history. Starting at number 6, it's Fernando Alonso's terrifying collision. If you've been keeping up with F1 for a while, then you might remember this devastating crash. Back in 2016, Alonso's car flipped through the air during the Australian Grand Prix. Now, keep in mind, this was while he was going at the lightning-fast speed of 200 miles per hour. But just what caused the crash to happen in the first place? Well, turns out, Alonso's McLaren collided with Esteban Gutierrez. Now, normally, crashes like these can have terrible outcomes. In some cases, they can even be fatal for the drivers involved. But luckily in this specific case, both drivers had minor injuries. And here's the coolest part. Fernando, even though he was flying in the air just moments earlier, managed to get out of the McLaren, all on his own after it landed. I don't know about his car, but the guy himself is definitely made of metal. In the world of F1, you sometimes end up seeing drivers survive things that feel downright impossible to get out of. Just consider this next driver. At number 5, it's Niki Lauda's infamous crash at the Bergwerk corner. This is by far one of the scariest moments in F1 history. Back in 1976, during the German Grand Prix, the weather was especially bad. So parts of the Nürburgring circuit were wet. And you know what that means, right? Things started to get slippery. Niki Lauda was the fastest driver on the circuit, and let's just say he could already sense this was going to lead to a disaster. So he asked his fellow drivers to call off the race. After all, going at ultra-fast speeds under track conditions like this is like asking for trouble. But did anyone listen to him? Nope. Turns out the race went ahead as planned. And then disaster struck at the infamous Bergwerk corner. Lauda lost control of his Ferrari, hit a wall, and his car burst into flames. The Austrian driver suffered severe burns to his head and hands, and inhaled hot fumes that damaged his lungs. He was rushed to the hospital, but things didn't look up for him even then. Lauda immediately fell into a coma, and to just about everyone, it looked like this was it for the legend. If you can believe it, he was read his last rites, and many thought he'd be the latest victim in the merciless world of F1 racing. But somehow, it's like Lauda came rushing back from the grave, because he woke up from his coma like a champ. Thankfully, he didn't have to suffer all that for nothing. Not only did it end up being a defining moment in his own career, but it was a good indicator that F1 needed to take a good look at its safety regulations. But while Niki was able to get out of this incident alive, sadly, not all F1 drivers are as lucky. And at number 4, Jules Bianchi's tragic death is proof of that. The Marussia star was involved in one of F1's worst tragedies. This happened during the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix, as the driver crashed into a recovery vehicle. The vehicle was there, attending to Adrian Sutil, who'd spun during the previous lap. Just as the tractor was trying to remove Sutil's car from the track, Bianchi lost control of his own. And, well, the result was terrible, to say the least. The 25-year-old was rushed to the hospital, but things weren't looking good for him. He'd suffered severe head trauma, and the chances of fully recovering from that weren't that great. But here's where things get even more tragic. Jules was kept in intensive care for months. But he just wasn't showing any signs of recovery. Eventually, in July 2015, even his father admitted that he didn't think Jules would recover. And sadly, within the same month, Bianchi passed away. Jules' dramatic crash shocked the entire F1 world, and honestly, it should. The guy had the potential to be one of the greatest drivers we've seen, but sadly, some things just aren't meant to be. Felipe Massa, who you all might know as another legendary driver in F1, described Bianchi's death as one of the worst days of his life. This is huge coming from him. After all, Massa himself has been involved in his fair share of accidents and crashes. And things are only getting more destructive from here on out. Because at number 3, it's Zhou Guanyu, who walked out of one of F1's most horrifying crashes. This took place at the British Grand Prix 2022. Chinese F1 driver Zhou Guanyu's Alfa Romeo collided with Mercedes driver George Russell and AlphaTauri's Pierre Gasly. The result? Zhou's car completely flipped and went flying towards the barrier. But that's not all. The rookie driver's car kept rolling ahead, getting stuck between the barrier and the catch fencing. It was a horrific sight that no F1 fan can forget, especially because even with all this destruction, it still somehow led to a happy ending. That's because Zhou not only survived the incident, but also managed to walk out without any major injuries. And as you'll see with a lot of these crashes, it wasn't all in vain. The crash led to the FIA focusing on making the Silverstone circuit a lot safer. And just to show everyone how much of a legend he was, Zhou came back to the circuit just a year later to give it another go. It couldn't have been easy for him, but hey, when you're a driver like Zhou, you just have so much focus that not even traumatic crashes can get in your way. Now, you can't talk about the most dramatic crashes in F1 history without mentioning this next one. At number 2, it's Max Verstappen's collision with Hamilton at the F1 Italian Grand Prix. These two have a well-known rivalry, but who would have thought it could get this intense? Here's how it all went down. Halfway into the race, Hamilton came out of the pits. As for Verstappen, well, he was closely following Hamilton from behind, but was slowed down a bit due to an 11-second pit stop. As they were both racing towards the opening chicane of the first corners of the lap, suddenly Max ran out of room and was forced over the curbs. And here's where things got really bad. His car started bouncing across the track, landing right on top of Hamilton's. This next bit sounds straight out of a horror film, because right after this happened, Max's rear right tire, with all its weight and momentum, came rushing straight for Lewis's head. That could have been it for the driver, but thankfully his Halo safety device came to the rescue. It was pretty much the only thing that stood between Lewis and certain death that day. Now, considering just how bad this crash was, both the drivers had to end their races right there. Daniel Ricciardo ended up taking the victory. Hamilton and Verstappen were able to walk away from the crash, but considering that they're serious rivals, they were probably really angry with each other after the collision. But they should have been happy that they got out of something so deadly, with just some bruises and a sore neck. Finally, there's one other dramatic crash that's just gotta be mentioned. And at number 1, it's Michael Schumacher's crash at the 2010 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Michael started from the 8th position, but things quickly got bad for him because he spun out on the opening lap at the turn 5-6 chicane. Now, while his car wasn't too damaged from the spin itself, Vitantonio Liuzzi came from out of nowhere and ended up mounting right on top of Schumacher's Mercedes. Every F1 fan's heart probably sank the second they saw this happen. And honestly, if the tiniest detail was different, the whole event could have been a lot more tragic. Because even though Liuzzi's car hit him, Michael escaped without any serious injuries. He even seemed unfazed by the incident. After a precautionary check, he was given the all-clear. And if you can believe it, Schumacher was already looking forward to F1 2011 shortly after the crash. His biggest regret? His race didn't end as excitedly as he'd hoped. That's certainly a positive outlook. The guy's got a fighting spirit, that's for sure. Anyway, if you want to check out some more content on F1 racing and its history, make sure to click on this next video.